What's going on, guys? I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is Replay Rewind. 1,000 video games across 50 years of gaming history. Can I play them all before I die? Well, we're gonna find out. Today we are playing the iconic launch title for the Atari 2600, Combat. This was released in 1977, falling into the shooter and arcade genre, though obviously shooter has very specific modern connotations now. Then, it would have, but, you are shooting at stuff, so it is technically a shooter. Again, this was originally for the Atari 2600. I played this using the Stella emulator, and I used the CX40 Plus wireless joystick, to really capture that, that very limited cardinal direction, playstyle, rather than using, like, a modern DualShock or something, or DualSense with just, like, the 360 degree, with those joysticks, right? This was developed and published by Atari. Notice that I think this is number 6 of the 1,000. And let me go through the list. So Pong was Atari, and Breakout was Atari, and this is Atari. So half of the games we've played so far have just been from Atari. And arguably Computer Space was also Atari, because it was basically made by all the guys who would then go on to make Atari. So they definitely are having an industry dominance right now, because at this point the industry is still so limited or scarce, right? So talking a little bit about the history of this, there's not too much that's going into this. Like I said, it served as a launch title for the Atari Video Computer System, later called the Atari 2600. And this game, I think there was 9 launch titles from what I read, but this game was like most associated with the launch of that console, because it was bundled with most 2600 consoles from 1977 when it was first released up until 1982, and then I think it was swapped out for Pac-Man, like an Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man. So in a lot of ways, this is like the quintessential Atari 2600 game. In a lot of ways, right? It was actually based on a prior Atari game called Tank. It was an arcade game from 1974. Part of me wishes I'd done a little bit more research. Maybe I could have / should have played it. But from what I was looking, it's basically the exact same thing, and I would imagine that this was like the more popular version of this. And it was being programmed while the 2600 was still under development. So again, it really kind of its creation and existence very much parallels the history of the console itself. Now again, the Atari 2600 was not the first home game console. That would have been the Magnavox Odyssey. But this was like a real big player. Because again, Magnavox was not necessarily a household name when it came to gaming, whereas Atari had already, made a name for itself and had not only grown its brand, but positive association with the brand from its arcade offerings. This was a fairly successful venture for the time. Obviously Atari, I had this whole thing in the beginning of like, almost more than half of these games have been Atari. I'm bringing all that up to kind of foreshadow, how Atari just slowly, fades away into irrelevancy. At least when it comes to the major moves being made in the gaming industry. So looking at the composite score, so eagle-eyed viewers, if you've been following, so these are scores from a bunch of different sources where people rate games. I decided to swap out the Metacritic critic scores to be Moby Games, so that way these are all user scores. So going forward from the second from the bottom, instead of being Metacritic critics, it'll be Moby Games, and I left Metacritic users for once we actually get to games that actually have a Metacritic score. But when you take all of these scores and you weight them out of 10, you kind of composite them all, that overall score is about a 6.3 out of 10. So okay, modern gamers, I think, the thing about older games is gamers have like a really weird thing about, and I guess people have this for anything, but you see it less in other mediums. Like, I feel like kids today, I sound so old, I'm like only 28, but like, kids or young adults, obviously there's people who don't like old movies or old books or old music, but there are still a sizable amount of people in that age bracket that do, right? Games is weird because it's so focused on the technology. you hear the terms often unplayable. It's unplayable. And people will say that about games that are very much playable, right? They're just stilted, or like the industry hadn't quite codified certain best practices yet, but they're still very much playable. But notably though, because these are user scores, these are biased again. These are always going to be biased against older games, because these are modern gamers putting these scores. Now, things like Pong or Pac-Man, those are still going to get higher scores. But, oops, sorry, I didn't mute my computer. That was a notification for something. They're going to give those kind of games higher scores, but that's because they're just so simple, right? So that's why they're playable, right? But something like Combat is a lot more intricate, at least by comparison. So I feel like the intricateness is brought down by the stiltedness of it. But we'll kind of get there. But my point with all of this is that it's not something super, super beloved by modern gamers today, right? So let's talk about the gameplay. So there are 27 different game modes, right? But they all boil down into essentially 3 categories. And I'm going to group these by the kind of vehicle you're controlling. The primary game modes are with the tanks, right? And I thought it was only tanks at first when I was doing research for this channel. And then I discovered, like, oh, there's I guess it is combat. Like, they want it to be any kind of vehicular combat you could think of. And within, I think there's something, I forget the exact number. But I want to say like a dozen different game modes of just the tanks, right? So like about half are just the tanks. And there's different kind of parameters or quirks about the different game modes that kind of add some variety. So you can basically you're controlling these 2 vehicles, red and blue, or green or whatever it is. And the goal is to get the other person. And there's a timer, but the timer isn't visible. I think it's something like 2 minutes or something. And the goal is just to get whoever can get the most points wins, right? And there's different kind of maps, if you will, right? So there's the very first game mode. Game mode number 1 is just an open field. So it's just 2 tanks just trying to get at each other. Then you have mazes. I believe this is the simple maze that you could see over here on my right. But then there's also like a complex maze. And then what was really interesting is some of the really creative game modes of invisible tank mode, where you're both invisible until you shoot, and then you are visible. So it like incentivizes you to like really get comfortable with the controls and almost have like an intuitive sense of where you are, shooting off a projectile every so often just to confirm where you are and what direction you're pointing in. So that's a really interesting. We tried that. So I played with Viviana, my fiance. So whenever I need a second player for a 2-player only game, she comes in and helps. But it was that we didn't play that one as much. What the one she really liked, and I'd argue because it was kind of a lot of luck, and that makes it easier for her to win because there's a lot more luck because she's not very good at gaming. Was essentially with the manual for the game called like Tank Pong. Well, it's not really Pong. It's more like billiards or pool, right? Where if you shoot your projectile, it's gonna bounce off the walls, and if it hits the other guy, you'll hit them and you'll get a point. And there's 2 versions of that where, you can either hit them dead on or bounce it off. But then there's versions where it's basically just like billiards, where you have to bounce off of a side before hitting, before hitting the thing. So you could aim your thing right at the other tank and it'll just go right through it because it needs to bounce off like a wall first or something, right? And there's also these elements of guided missiles, right? So some of the modes, it's kind of like computer space. And I was happy to see this returned, because you don't see it in Pong. Despite the fact that Pong is a ripoff of like the tennis game for Magnavox Odyssey, which did have like guided balls essentially. This has guided missiles where, when you shoot it and if you turn your joystick while it's in motion, it'll move. It's way more finicky than the computer space missiles, just because you're using such a stilted, and maybe also the joysticks may have also been stilted because like they're brand new, right? Like we haven't broken them in, but even still, it's not full rotational analog. It's very much like up. It's like north, northwest, west. No, like it's only the 8 possible directions, right? There really is no variations or permutations within those, right? It's not analog. But that was like another interesting feature that helped a lot. Since you can't, you can't slightly turn your tank the way you just want it. You either go here or here, like it snaps. The guided missile element was actually really useful because it's like if you can angle it just right and then at the last second kind of move your missile to hit the guy, your opponent. It's gonna be a lot of fun. So I really liked this game because it's deceptively simple, but there's like a lot in relative terms. There's a lot of mechanical strategy that you can, you're worried about your movement, you're worried about your projectiles, how you're gonna are you gonna move your projectile once it's fired. If you're playing one of those other modes, are you gonna try to ricochet it off of the walls? With the maze, you have to try to strategize, and all the while, your opponent is doing the exact same thing. So you have to contend also with not just offense, but defense. And it was very enjoyable. Like, I actually really enjoyed playing this. Again, despite the stilted controls. And speaking of controls, not only is it stilted just because of you really only have 8 options of where you want to turn or go. These are also tank controls, right? And this is something that you don't see as much anymore, but it still exists beyond games with literal tanks. But essentially, tank controls are when you are moving your joystick or your arrow button, whatever the controller is throughout the history of gaming. You are moving as if you are the avatar. So, like, look at this screen here. Look at this still on the screen, for example, right? Let's say I'm blue. Intuitively, based off of, like, more modern controller schema, if I want to go down, if I want to go to the bottom part of the map and I'm blue, I would tilt the joystick down. But that's not how tank controls work. If you want to go down, if you're already facing down, you would actually press up on the joystick because you're facing down, right? So it's not about pointing where you want to go on the screen. It's about what direction do you want to move in based off of where you're already facing. Which at first I thought was going to be a lot more annoying, but it started to become a lot more intuitive as you go on. You can't go backwards, which was interesting. Which is weird because I'm pretty sure can't tanks go backwards? I don't know. Maybe they can't. I don't know. I'm not a tank aficionado, right? I know Viviana struggled with that a lot more. The tank controls, because again, intuitively, just based off of other kinds of games that we've played throughout gaming history, you want to tilt when you're playing a 2D top-down game. You think to go to a certain place, you have to move your joystick in the direction of that place, not as if you're in the tank and if you want to go forward, you have to press forward, right? But then there were also 2 other buckets of game modes. There was the biplanes and jets. So both of them, you're fighting in the sky. There's no mazes, but there are clouds, and I believe there's always clouds. So when you fly through a cloud, you are disguised, you're hidden, which is an interesting idea for a mechanic, except for the fact that you can't stay in one place. Like, you're moving, you're in a plane or a jet, so you're only in there for so long. So I never really found much use. I never found much strategic use for hiding in the clouds, right? Just because they're just moving too fast. And also the controls for the biplane and the jets were much more confusing and much less intuitive, right? Because at least with this is like top down, but theoretically, when you're playing the jets or the planes, you're looking at it from a side view. So it's not the same controls, luckily, but the new controls are also unintuitive. It's like, basically, up in either direction is to turn clockwise, and going up left or up right determines the speed of how you're turning, and then down left or down right is to turn counterclockwise, and then depending on which left or right is your speed, right? That's for the biplane. The jets, I believe, were similar to the tanks, essentially, but it was frustrating. So the controls were easier for the jets than the biplanes, but it was more frustrating than challenging, because since they're not only moving, like with the tanks, you could just sit there and think about what you want to do. The jets are always moving, and they're moving fast, right? So again, it was more frustrating than challenging. Again, I think the real draw of this game, and I imagine what was the most interesting part, and the reason why it takes up most of the game modes, and they're the first game modes, it makes sense that it's the tanks. I think the tanks are the real draw here. In terms of story, there is zero, right? There is zero story. I guess the only thing is that, unlike Pong, we're not just shapes. Like, okay, we are shapes. Like, okay, it's kind of hard to, like, if you just saw these shapes out of context, you wouldn't necessarily know they're tanks, but knowing what the game is about and knowing, like, when you're reading the manual, like, okay, this is like the tank mode, they are tanks. So I guess that's like literally the only story, is that you are in tanks, but you don't have a sense of character, or at least with Breakout, there was like a framing device of like you're like a prisoner trying to like escape. So there's like, very simple, but there's like the bones of a story. There is a character trying to accomplish something, right? With this, there's not character trying to accomplish something. You are just trying to accomplish something. You are trying to hit your opponent. And again, I'm not trying to hold games like this to a higher standard, but I think it's just interesting to diagnose and talk about these as we go along with these games, that notably there is no framing device, there is no story, there are no characters. And I bring these up so that when we do get those, it'll be like, whoa, like that's new, that's different, right? But in terms of the presentation, similarly, very simple. I think this is one, except for maybe Breakout, this is the best looking of the games we've played. Computer Space was more complex because you had the stars, but it would get, like I talked about, it wasn't as legible because everything was black and white. Whereas this, if you were playing on a color TV, the high contrast really, really helps. And despite the fact that the little projectiles are so small, because the contrast is especially if you're the blue right there, it's you always have a very clear sense of where everything is. Which again, it sounds like something like that's the bar is really low, but for these early games, that's not necessarily a given. Again, they're still figuring out best practices. So, again, it was very visually appealing. Again, that being said, though, like, we're not really going to see it just yet because, again, Pong was very simple graphically. Breakout was very simple graphically. But we're going to see, the fact this is a home console game, the graphics are going to be more scaled back, right? And that's always the case for most of gaming history, because in an arcade cabinet, you could put a lot more power under the hood, but you could justify the cost because, like, an arcade would buy the whole thing, and then they would just be able to get the quarters day after day, week after week, month after month, right? Whereas with a home console, that financial calculus isn't quite the same. So that's why we're going to see a lot that arcades are going to be like the cutting edge of graphics for a lot of this. But again, very, very simple presentation. The something though about the audio was kind of annoying, that like there was just like this like low like, and I couldn't tell if it's like the console having some kind of glitch or if it's the emulator. I looked it up and I think that's just meant to be the sound of the tanks. I'm not sure, but that was like a little annoying. I feel like that we could have done without that. So just a little bit of trivia that I found about this game, just to kind of keep things a little interesting. Let me read here. Quote, "A peculiar bug exists in the Tank Pong version of the game. If a player presses one of the tanks against the top left wall of the arena and fires at the same time, the tank will fly repeatedly from left to right across the screen, wrapping around and coming back to the other side." I never experienced that, but that is like a funny little quirk. And again, if you're like a kid in the 70s, you have nothing else to do, like, you may very well discover these quirks, because like you're just gonna play this. And that's another thing I didn't bring up, is that the fact there's so many game modes, I feel like you got like a lot of bang for your buck, right? As a kid, it's not just the same exact game over and over. Like you could play just like one game mode to death for a really long time and then get bored of it, but you have like 26 others to play around with and try out. Another piece of trivia is something I found here. A sequel to Combat went into development for the Atari 2600 and was to be titled Combat 2, but not the number, spelled TWO. It was officially announced by Atari in 1982, and the game would have included landscape elements such as water, forest, and bridges, as well as a level editor. Well, that's really ahead of its time, and I like the idea of having more environmental things as opposed to just like these geometric shapes here. The game was officially announced, but was never officially released for the system. An incomplete prototype of the game surfaced in 1999, well, that's a long time later, by former Atari Age magazine editor Steve Morgenstern. And if you go on Combat's like Wikipedia page and look under Legacy, you can read all about this. I basically just took this is just a copy and pasted from Wikipedia, but you can find like a screenshot that shows like a river and some trees. Like, so it would have been like an interesting idea, again, putting you more in the world of the game. Whereas with something like this, it still feels very much removed, rather than like you're role playing as this tank or this jet or whatever it is, right? So my final thoughts, again, like a lot of these Atari games, simple but fun, and I could see why it stirred up so much interest in the medium, right? And again, Atari they're really excelling at finding the fun in essentially just moving geometry, right? Again, not very many, really no framing devices, no story, no characters. It's just shapes moving around and doing stuff to the other shapes. Which I guess that's all games, right? On a deep level, but in this case, the games are very simple. Though I think I remember reading in the Wikipedia article that even by the early 80s, these graphics were considered outdated, right? So, but I think we just got to take it for what it was at the time. And I think especially the legibility really gets high praise from me, just because it makes my life easier trying to play the game. So it's now time for me to give this a score from 1 to 10, and I'm going to give this game, I'm going to give Combat, drum roll please, a 7. I thought it was good. I thought maybe this isn't fair, but I feel like, I don't know if I would have given it an 8 had this been different, but I feel like the other game modes are like kind of bring it down a little, like with the biplane and the jet, and I guess I could just not play those modes, but it then begs the question, like, okay, instead of all of those, could they have made more creative uses of the tanks, or just really refined the 15 tank game modes they had? I just feel like this is a lot of fun, but it's not necessarily, and I would play this again, but it's not something that I'm going to put up on a pedestal like, this is a Hall of Fame, one of the best games ever made. Breakout is, though. Breakout is actually phenomenal. So coming up, this is getting exciting. We're starting to get a lot more like big name games. We're going to be playing Space Invaders from 1978, going back to arcades. I gotta have to bust out my big X Arcade Tank Stick Max. I don't know why I say the full name of the controller every time. I'm not sponsored by them, unfortunately. But that's the show. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like this video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And if you have found the channel, why not subscribe? I'm trying to, I'm not sure how far I'm going to get on this journey, but journeys are always better with others. And don't forget to comment below and let me know what you think of Combat. Until next time, peace out.